Some Hollywood stories are told so often they begin to sound like myths. They are polished, simplified, and repeated until all the rough edges disappear. What remains is success without struggle, fame without rejection, victory without cost. Sylvester Stallone's story is usually presented that way. But before the awards, the box office records, and the global recognition, there was a version of his life Hollywood preferred to ignore. Sylvester Gardanzio Stallone was born in July 1946 in New York City. From the moment he entered the world, things went wrong. A medical complication during birth damaged nerves in his face, leaving part of his facial muscles permanently paralyzed. The result was a slurred speech pattern and a distinctive expression that would later become instantly recognizable. As a child, however, it was not seen as unique or memorable. It was seen as a flaw. Growing up, Stallone struggled to fit in. He moved frequently between schools and had difficulty with academics. Teachers often labeled him as unfocused or problematic. His speech and appearance made him an easy target for ridicule, and socially he remained isolated. There was no early sign that he would become an actor, let alone a leading man. In fact, most signals pointed in the opposite direction. What Stallone did have was a deep interest in physical discipline and storytelling. Sports became an outlet, particularly weight training and boxing. At the same time, movies began to shape his imagination. He was drawn not to glamorous heroes, but to characters who fought uphill battles, men who were underestimated and forced to prove themselves. Those themes would later define his work, but at the time they reflected his own reality more than any creative vision. In the early 1970s, Stallone moved to Los Angeles with the same dream shared by thousands before him. Hollywood, however, had little interest in returning the favor. Casting agents repeatedly dismissed him. The reasons were blunt and consistent. His look was wrong. His voice was wrong. He did not fit the image of a leading actor. Stallone later recalled being told that the camera simply did not like him. Rejection quickly turned into financial desperation. Stallone took whatever work he could find, including minor film roles, odd jobs, and temporary labor. At one point, his situation became so severe that he sold his dog because he could no longer afford to feed it. This detail has often been repeated as a motivational anecdote, but at the time it was not symbolic. It was survival. Then, in 1975, something unexpected happened. Stallone watched a heavyweight boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner. Wepner was not supposed to last long. He was outmatched, outclassed, and largely dismissed. Yet he endured. For Stallone, the fight felt personal. It mirrored his own position in Hollywood, underestimated, ignored, but still standing. Inspired, Stallone sat down and wrote a screenplay. The story followed a small-time boxer, given one improbable chance at greatness. He called it Rocky. The script was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. It was not designed to impress studios. It was designed to reflect truth. When Hollywood finally showed interest, the reaction was complicated. Producers liked the script, but they did not want Stallone in the lead role. They offered to buy the story while replacing him with a more established actor. For someone in Stallone's position, this should have been the end of the discussion. He needed the money. He needed the break. Instead, he refused. That decision did not make him famous overnight. It made him uncertain, vulnerable, and even more exposed. At that moment, Sylvester Stallone was still an outsider, gambling everything on a belief few others shared. What followed would redefine his life and challenge Hollywood's assumptions, but the outcome was far from guaranteed. When Sylvester Stallone refused to sell Rocky without himself attached to the lead role, Hollywood did not suddenly respect him. The industry tolerated him. Studio executives saw him not as a visionary, but as an obstacle attached to an otherwise promising script. From their perspective, replacing Stallone with a bankable star was simple logic. Keeping him was a risk no one wanted to explain. If the film failed, eventually, a compromise was reached. The budget was cut dramatically. Expectations were lowered. The film would be made quickly, quietly, and without much confidence. For Stallone, this was not a victory. It was merely permission to try. Filming Rocky in 1975 was nothing like the glamorous productions Hollywood was known for. The crew was small, the equipment limited, and the schedule unforgiving. Many scenes were shot guerrilla style on the streets of Philadelphia, sometimes without permits. Stallone himself endured physical strain, long days, and constant pressure to prove he belonged in front of the camera. The boxing scenes, in particular, were punishing. Stallone insisted on realism, even when it meant taking real hits. He was not trained as a professional boxer, but he approached the role with the same discipline that had shaped his early years. Pain was part of the process, not something to be avoided. This attitude would later define his public image, but at the time it was simply necessity. When Rocky was released in 1976, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Audiences connected with the story in a way no one had predicted. The film was not just about boxing, it was about dignity, perseverance, and being seen after a lifetime of being overlooked. Stallone, once dismissed as unfit for leading roles, became the face of that message. Rocky went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. Stallone received nominations for Best Actor and Best Original Screenplay. Overnight, he was no longer invisible. He was everywhere. Interviews, magazine covers, television appearances. Hollywood had embraced him, but only after the success was undeniable. Yet success brought its own complications. Stallone was quickly typecast as a symbol of raw masculinity. The industry celebrated his physical presence, while often minimizing his role as a writer and creative force. Critics questioned whether he was a serious actor or simply a product of a specific moment in American culture. In the early 1980s, Stallone doubled down on characters defined by endurance and confrontation. With First Blood and later Rambo, he portrayed a traumatized Vietnam veteran struggling against institutions that had abandoned him. Contrary to popular perception, the original Rambo was not a glorification of violence. It was a bleak commentary on neglect, authority, and psychological damage. Over time, however, public interpretation shifted. The character became politicized. The nuance was lost. Stallone found himself associated with a simplified image that did not reflect his intentions. While the films were commercially successful, they reinforced a narrow understanding of who he was as an artist. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Stallone was one of the biggest stars in the world. He competed directly with Arnold Schwarzenegger, both professionally and symbolically. Their rivalry was fueled by box office numbers, media narratives, and an era obsessed with dominance. But as trends changed, so did Hollywood's priorities. The industry began to move away from the kind of heroes Stallone represented. Big-budget action films declined. New stars emerged. Stallone's projects began to underperform. Films that once would have been guaranteed hits struggled to find audiences. Critics were increasingly harsh, framing his work as outdated. This shift was not gradual. It was abrupt. One moment Stallone was indispensable. The next, he was expendable. In the late 1990s, his career entered a period often described as decline. Roles became less frequent. Budgets shrank. Public interest faded. Hollywood, which had once celebrated him, now treated him as a relic of another era. For many actors, this would have been the end. But Stallone did not disappear. Instead, he reassessed. He returned to the characters that had defined him, not to repeat past success, but to confront it. In Rocky Balboa and later Rambo, he portrayed aging versions of his iconic roles. These films were quieter, more reflective, and openly aware of time's impact. They were not attempts to reclaim youth. They were acknowledgments of endurance. What Hollywood did not expect was that this self-awareness would resonate, and what came next would place Stallone back at the center of attention, not as a symbol of the past, but as proof that reinvention does not always mean surrender. As Stallone's career cooled, the narrative around him hardened. Hollywood had a habit of rewriting history once usefulness faded. The same industry that had praised his discipline now framed him as inflexible. Executives spoke of him in private meetings as someone from another time, an actor whose appeal belonged to a past audience. This shift was not unique to Stallone, but it was especially visible in his case, because his rise had been so dramatic. What made this period particularly isolating was that Stallone was not simply losing roles, he was losing control. Projects he believed in were rejected early. Scripts he wrote were passed over without serious discussion. The creative authority he once fought to earn slowly slipped away. Unlike younger actors, he could not reinvent himself quietly. His image was too well defined, too public, too symbolic. Yet behind the scenes, Stallone continued to write. He refined ideas, revisited themes of aging, regret, and unfinished purpose. These were not the stories Hollywood wanted at the time, but they were the stories he felt compelled to tell. While box office numbers declined, his focus shifted inward. Survival was no longer about fame. It was about relevance on his own terms. This internal recalibration would prove essential, because when the opportunity to return finally came, Stallone was no longer chasing approval. He was preparing for a different kind of confrontation, one with time itself. By the early 2010s, Sylvester Stallone's career had entered a phase few actors reach with clarity. He was no longer chasing relevance, nor attempting to compete with younger stars. Instead, he leaned into authorship. Projects like The Expendables reframed him not as a solitary action hero, but as a curator of a fading cinematic era. He brought together actors who, like him, had defined a generation and placed them in a narrative that acknowledged age rather than denying it. Yet Stallone's most unexpected reinvention arrived not in theaters, but on television. In 2022, Tulsa King premiered on Paramount+. Stallone starred as Dwight the General Manfredi, a New York mobster released from prison after decades, only to be exiled to Oklahoma by the very organization he once served. The premise mirrored Stallone's own trajectory in subtle ways.
a powerful figure navigating irrelevance, betrayal, and reinvention in unfamiliar territory. The series was a success. It quickly became one of Paramount Plus' most watched original productions and introduced Stallone to a new audience. Critics noted a shift in his performance style. The physical dominance remained, but it was tempered by restraint. Silence became as important as dialogue. Humor emerged not from bravado, but from contrast. For the first time in years, Stallone was being discussed not just as a symbol, but as a character actor. Stallone himself described the role as a convergence of everything he had done before. In interviews, he explained that Tulsa King allowed him to combine the vulnerability of Rocky with the discipline of Rambo, while operating within a modern storytelling framework. It was, in his words, the best of both worlds. However, renewed visibility also brought renewed scrutiny. In early 2024, reports emerged alleging inappropriate language used by Stallone on the set of Tulsa King. The accusations centered on remarks reportedly made toward background actors. Paramount confirmed that the matter was reviewed internally. The show's director publicly denied that any offensive behavior occurred, stating that the claims were mischaracterized and taken out of context. No formal disciplinary action was announced. Still, the incident reignited a familiar debate. To some observers, Stallone represented a figure incompatible with modern cultural expectations. To others, he embodied a resistance to constant self-censorship. What remained consistent was that Stallone, once again, found himself at the center of a conversation larger than any single role. Throughout his career, this pattern repeated. Stallone rose, fell, returned, and was questioned, not only for what he created, but for what he symbolized. Hollywood never fully decided how to categorize him. He was too physical to be purely intellectual, too introspective to be dismissed as simple, too stubborn to be reshaped on command. In later interviews, Stallone spoke candidly about aging. He rejected the idea of retirement, not as defiance, but as misunderstanding. To him, creative work was not something one stepped away from. It was something one adapted to. He described himself as someone built for creative conflict, a phrase that captured the tension between his instincts and the industry around him. The renewal of Tulsa King for additional seasons confirmed what numbers already suggested. There was still demand, still an audience, still curiosity, and yet the question surrounding Stallone's legacy remains unresolved. Is he a product of a past Hollywood that no longer exists? Or is he proof that endurance, when combined with self-awareness, can outlast trends? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, because Sylvester Stallone was never designed to fit comfortably into any era. He entered Hollywood unwanted, survived it misunderstood, and remains within it unapologetic, and maybe that is why his story continues to resist a final ending.